Welcome to the Real News Network. My name is Gregory Wilbert, and I'm coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. We're talking to Professor Boaventura de Sousa Santos, sociology professor at Coimbra University in Portugal. And we're talking about the situation in Brazil, and we'll also be analyzing, in the second part, the situation in Latin America more generally, with the other legislative coups that have taken place in Latin America in the past couple of years. So first of all, thanks, Professor Boaventura de Sousa Santos, for joining us again for part two. You mentioned the social movements. Is there anything you think that they can be doing in order to reverse or to resolve this situation?
Well, there are two movements that are being, taking place at the same time. One is the international move, which within the continent, with UNASUR, when the Parla Sur, which is the parliament of the south, that is supposed to convene in Brasilia. That is to say, international pressure in the continent to delegitimize what is going on as a kind of a political assassination, as a kind of a parliamentary coup, which is a kind of a state of exception within a constitutional, supposedly constitutional normal situation. So this is the international pressure is being strong, and some of the heads of states has already pronounced themselves. But we have seen that before in other situations, and they were not very efficient. The second of all is the social movements. In fact, they are on the streets. They are organizing several at the different levels to try to put pressure on the Senate. I doubt that this pressure will be successful. The movements have basically two claims. The first one is against impeachment, so this government should continue, but a new government. So the second claim is as strong as the first one, a different government. We cannot have a government in which the Minister of Agriculture is the head of the biggest landowners and industrial agriculture that is so much responsible for dispossession, for assassination of peasant leaders, of indigenous leaders. We cannot go on with a government headed by Dilma with these characteristics. So a different government, a left or center-left government until 2018. That's what they are trying to do. We don't know. I mean, it's absolutely uncertain whether they will succeed or not.
Well, just turning to the larger context in Latin America, and, I mentioned in the introduction that both Paraguay and Honduras faced a similar issue with the removal of Zelaya and Fernando Lugo. Would you compare it to that situation? And if so, what does that say about Latin American politics and Latin American political systems?
Well, concerning the first question, of course, there are very strong similarities, and there are also differences. Concerning Zelaya, Zelaya was deposed in 2009 because he was trying to have a non-binding referendum on a constitutional assembly to change the constitution. That is to say, Manuel Zelaya was addressing the problem that is now at the core of all Latin American politics. Without a political reform, it will be impossible to have a sustainable democracy in Latin America. So he was trying to do that. Supreme Court decided that it was illegal. And since it was illegal and Manuel Zelaya refused, then the Supreme Court ordered his arrest. But here, the military intervened, and instead of a trial, they sent him into exile. So here you have a very active intervention of the military forces, which we don't have in Brazil. But again, the parliamentary presence is the same. I mean, there was no change in the constitution, no change in the normal constitution, and in fact, the vice president came to power, and then, of course, we had in 2010 a new election, and while Zelaya was in exile. And then the parliament just decided that the vice president should become the new president. And in the case of Fernando Lugo was in power since 2009, and it was, as Zelaya, and as you can see that in the broader context of Latin America, as in the case of Zelaya, as in the case of Lugo, as in the case of Dilma and Lula, As in the case of Cristina Kirchner, these people came to power after, several decades of government by the oligarchies, by the dominant classes that traditionally have governed Latin America. In the case of Paraguay, the two parties, the Liberal Party and the Colorado Party. And Lugo won and then made an alliance with Liberal, which became the vice president. But there is a cable from the US Embassy in 2009, and note, he was deposed, impeached in 2012, but in 2009, there is a cable that came out through the WikiLeaks by the US Embassy, in which they say that the ex-president, Nicanor Duarte, is trying to invent a cause célèbre, that is to say, a pretext, a reason to create a situation of impeachment against Fernando Lugo, so that he would be deposed and the vice president would become the president. Well, that's precisely what happened 3 years later in 2012. And the cause célèbre here was a kind of a supposedly illegal land purchase, was a conflict with peasants, and was a serious conflict in which many people believe that they were infiltrated by provocateurs, because weapons were used that are never used by the peasants in Paraguay. And in fact, this created a kind of a political turmoil. And in the end, that kind of unrest was considered enough reason for the parliament to impeach Fernando Lugo. And in fact, they didn't give him any time for defense. Fernando Lugo had 2 hours to defend himself. And so it was really a mockery of democracy, but again, within a kind of a context of normal constitutional proceeding. I mean, nothing happened. There was no dictatorship. There was no formal state of emergency. Everything was normal. But in fact, what this case also showed, as in the case of Zelaya, is that from now on, as the case of Brazil is showing, the Constitution is a convenience store. I mean, it can be used for any purpose, to buy anything, because any interpretation is available and can be used to depose a government that has been legitimately elected. We don't like it, but you invent a cause célèbre, as it is in that cable of the US Embassy. I think the cause célèbre in Brazil was the Operation Car Wash, of course, that has nothing to do with, formally, with the impeachment, because nothing is brought against the president, but created a kind of a commotion about corruption and the fight around corruption, in particular about the corruption of the party that is in power, the PT, that create this social and political environment conducive to the idea of the impeachment. But we know that the impeachment was spoken about by the conservative forces right after the election. I mean, they were really waiting for the cause célèbre, and they were waiting for that, and they found it, and as they did in Paraguay, and as they did also with the Zelaya, which is referendum. So in all these cases, we have a new form, a political form that is emerging in Latin America, which we could call the neo-coup. It's not a military coup. Everything is not a state of emergency. Everything is a constitutional normal type of procedure, but really a twisting of the normal constitutional safeguards in order to serve the interests of those that have been defeated in elections, don't like it. They feel powerful enough because they have at their services the media to depose a legitimately elected president. And this is happening too often in Latin America to make us worry about the future of democracy in Latin America.
Yes, unfortunately, we've run out of time now, but I just want to add one quick comment about the situation from what you've been saying. It seems like one lesson that one could perhaps also draw from all of this is that the governments would have to also that is, the progressive governments also need to make sure that they take control of the parliament, because that apparently wasn't the case in Honduras and in Brazil and in Paraguay, whereas in Venezuela, for a long time, the government did have that is the president, did have the same a majority in the parliament, and that made a huge difference, I think. Anyway, but unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we need to cut this off. But hopefully, we'll definitely follow up again, depending on what happens next week, probably when the Senate votes. So thanks so much again, Boaventura, for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.